Okay. All right. So we will go ahead and get started. We can go back to the presentation. Okay, so today we've got a very similar agenda to earlier in the week with cycle 1. For those of you who joined us for cycle 1, again, this is being recorded. It will be put up probably Monday onto the YouTube site, so you'll have it for your reference as well. But we'll look at the year 5 changes to the CalTPA cycle 2. We'll provide wherever possible the rationale for those changes. We'll look at the program guide, and we'll actually do pretty much a deep step-by-step run through the guide as well. And then we're going to review the condition codes as they have been revised somewhat, not completely, mostly for clarity, so that we took away some of the condition codes that were not particularly clear. And so we'll talk about those and then answering questions. But as we go through, feel free to post your questions in the chat, and we will work to keep you it answer those questions as we go. Sorry, my computer is going nuts on me here. Okay. So next slide, please. Thank you, Caroline. Again, so for meeting norms, so again, questions in the chat are great, but if you also want to raise your hand, you can to ask a question, that's fine too. But unmute yourself when you want to comment or ask a question, but also keep it on mute if at all possible to reduce the noise. We, as always, we'd like you to keep your questions to a general focus about the CalTPA and what's being presented. If you have questions about your program or about specific candidate, there's opportunities for you to reach out in other venues for that. Avoiding multitasking, we're going to go fairly quickly through this. There's a lot of information to present, but we'll be as clear as possible for you, and then honoring time for both participants and presenters by moderating questions. So with that, we will go to the guide.
Okay, so
yeah, go ahead.
I am going to put into the chat a link and a password. That link is going to get here, sorry, take you to this website. This website has tons of resources, but what we're going to focus on today is the piece right under this call out box is the assessment materials. There you will find all of the multiple subject, single subject, world language materials, as well as summary of changes from your 4 to year 5 and the TPA program guide. When you click this, whichever one you need, it will download to your device, and then you will open it up. And when you go to open the program or assessment guide, it will prompt you with the password that I put into the chat. I will just mention that we're going to go today through the multiple subject guide. So the page numbers might be a little bit off, but it's generally all still the same.
Okay. Thank you, Caroline.
Yep.
Okay, and if we can make that just a bit bigger. There we go. Okay, so going to the bottom of the cover page, we want to make sure we always draw a candidate's attention to which version it is. So making sure that candidates are submitting on year 5 templates and using the year 5 guides going forward. Their submissions will still be scored if they use year 4, but again, the updated guide has some things we don't want them to miss in terms of clarity and support for them, and there's a couple of additional prompts. So we can move forward. And this first piece, if you were joining us on Tuesday, the first part of the information goes across both guides. So we've highlighted English learners here that used to say English learners and standard English learners. And from the CalTPA, we've taken away the requirement or the language around standard English learners, as the CDE does not use that in their work. And so we're getting aligned with the CDE around that. That was often a question for candidates about how do they identify standard English learners. So if we scroll down, this is all pretty much the same. Overview is not much different. And again, as Caroline's scrolling us down, I will say that the most of the changes, as with cycle 1, are intended to provide clarity and more instruction for the candidate. Cycle 2 has a few more changes to rubrics than cycle 1 did. Cycle 1 had a couple of little wordsmithing pieces, but there's a couple of changes to cycle 2 that we will get to as we go through the rubrics. We've added the concept of development here, as well as the idea of student development through the learning goals as well. Also advice to candidates here that we want them to write out the content and ELD standards and not refer only to the content or ELD standard number. You'll see a lot of changes, as with cycle 1, that are related to the standards, citation of standards, learning goals, and ELD standards, because we see a lot of candidates that's still the biggest number of condition codes, or a large number of condition codes go to something related to learning goals or standards, citation of standards. So we really emphasize that in this year. So as we move forward, this is all the same. We'll skip through. I don't think there are any changes to the evidence table, because the steps were not really substantially changed, just the guidance in it. Okay, so again, step 1 plan. Before we move to the next, I'm just going to give a highlight here. So in cycle 1, as you remember, candidates planned 1 lesson for a group of students. And they develop some informal assessments and monitor student learning, and then reflect on what happened in that lesson, and then apply that thinking to future lessons with that student, with that group of students. For cycle 2, it's more complex by design. So they're planning a learning segment from a larger unit of 3 to 5 lessons that they will document. They're also going to be developing informal assessments, student self-assessments, and formal assessments. They're going to be incorporating educational technology into this one and demonstrating that. When we get to the teach piece, we'll talk about that, but each of the steps has a little bit more involvement, because we're looking for more for them to document here. And we're also over the course of 3 to 5 lessons, it's more information for them to include. So I see D. Abraham, I just wanted to confirm, if a candidate had their TPA returned and did not pass, we should encourage them to utilize version 5. However, they're able to, yes. So they are able to still submit on version 4. But again, the guides and the prompts and the templates have been redesigned a little bit to support them. So it's in their best interest to revise that. I would say it's probably about 98% of it is just cut and paste over to the new templates. Okay, so candidates get the first step as in, because this is all asset-based, focused or based on asset-based instruction and understanding your students' funds of knowledge. The steps are the same for the first part of cycle 2, that they get to know the students and document the context for learning. We've taken out, again, the supervising mentor teacher. We used to have the term master teacher there, so that's been removed from the guides. So again, step 1, they're doing that description of students' assets and learning needs, thinking about the prior academic knowledge, their English language proficiency, the cultural and linguistic resources and funds of knowledge. One thing with cycle 2 as well. So if they have English learners designated English learners in their class, and they've cited that they are there, they have to have a ELD standard and learning goals. If they don't have any, which is very rare in California, I would say, then they don't need to have those for cycle 2. But if there are any English learners in the group, they need to have those standards. So again, thinking about the students' prior experiences, that's related to the content, and then their experience using educational technology and assistive technologies. So then we have the basic context information for the class. What's the grade level, number of students, age of students, number of students with IEPs, number of students who are English learners. Is it, again, all of the sort of straightforward information about the context. Then they plan the learning segment. And unlike cycle 1, they have to use the learning segment template of 3 to 5 lessons. What they just do is they duplicate as many as they need to and put it all into one document, so that they have those 3 to 5 lessons. So what they're, again, planning this 3 to 5 lesson learning segment, they need to pay attention to the instruction assessment that's asset-based, what the UDL practices are that they're going to utilize. We have a call out. That's one of the changes to the template for cycle 2, is that we actually have a prompt that calls out what are the UDL strategies that you're going to be using. So that's one of the ways that the new templates will assist them. They think about what their informal assessments are. They think about their student self-assessment and develop a rubric for that for the students to use. And then they develop a formal assessment and a rubric for that. Okay, so in this planning stage, this call out box is really a key thing for them if they are thinking about doing a formal assessment that is a group assessment. We'll come back to this a little bit later, because in the step-by-step, it's also outlined what they're going to be, what they need to think about. So, and I'll talk about this as an example from our office hours this week. We had a candidate come in, and she is a music teacher, and her formal assessment, which was a orchestral performance, which is great. You know, we want to see candidates having students do real work or really applying their learning into this. And she had gotten a condition code because it wasn't clear. The student work sample that she submitted, there were 3 of them, were video clips of the concert. The problem with her submission was that she had not, you couldn't tell which student, the student who met expectations, the student who exceeded expectations, and the student who didn't exceed expectations. You couldn't tell who those students were, and she didn't give them rubric-based feedback based on their individual performance. So when we talked with her, it was really clear that actually she did know. She could point to that student. She said the student that was the one who exceeded expectations was the first chair playing the viola. And we said, how do you know she exceeded expectations? And she talked about, you know, her bow. She could tell that her bow was moving correctly. She could tell that her professionalism, that was all related to her outcomes. And so it became clear that she actually really knew why that student exceeded expectations. She knew what kind of feedback to give that student, and she could describe how she knew that that student had exceeded expectations. And so what she just needed to do was write that up in her TPA, and that's unacceptable because you can see the assessor needs to see that the candidate knows which student did what, and their learning related to the learning goals. They need to provide that individual about the individual learning of the students to each of those 3 students. And then they need to be able to document in, if you have a group video clip or something like that, which student did what, or even if it's a document that the students have done collaboratively, how can you tell which students contributed which parts to that? So that's around this idea for group work. That's what we're really getting at. We really encourage it because we want candidates to use effective pedagogies. And they can document it if they sort of really follow these requirements. It's also listed a little bit later in the document as well under step 3. Okay, as for in cycle 1, we've duplicated the same call out box for cycle 2 about current content standards and curriculum frameworks and ELD standards. So we have here more fully elaborated that they must use the current versions. We also, if a candidate is placed in a transitional kindergarten, there's advice on which standards to use there. And then again, that language around citing the content and ELD standards and not refer only to the content or the ELD standard number. We then have under citing ELD standards, we have pretty clear advice on how to do that. So it's chapter 3 of that English of the ELD standards. And they need to cite the part number of the standard. They need to cite the letter and name of the heading, and they need to cite the standard number and include the text of what the standard is. We've given an example of that citation from a 3rd grade ELD standard. So has all those parts that are described above. And we then have 2 example learning goals based on that standard. So these are a model that we've created. The assessors won't be total sticklers if they don't have it exactly like this, but we want to be able to see that they have accessed the appropriate standard document and that they know how to interpret how those standards are written. So one of the keys here is that ELD standards are written slightly different than ELA standards, for example. So we want to make sure that they know the difference between what those standards are and that they're demonstrating that with evidence. Okay, also highlighted here, ELD standards and goals must also be in bilingual classroom settings. And we talked about this a little bit before. Also in the program guide, there's some information on things like translanguaging. The reason for this is that even if a candidate is a bilingual teacher, they need their credential says that they are certified to teach English language development as well as whatever subject area that they're teaching, and that bilingual development. So the idea of them, thinking about structure of language and the target language and in English and thinking about how those two are parallel is one way that they can think about how to develop English as they're also developing the students' target language. Here we change it. This is what I referred to a little bit on. So all of these prompts here, actually, can we go up a little bit? So again, these are all prompts from the learning segment template. So again, they have the learning goals, what their evidence and assessments are, how everything fits together, where do things come in the lessons. And again, these prompts are all duplicated on the learning segment template. What the activities are, what is it that the students are going to do, what is the teacher going to do. This is the one we highlighted that we have now, what are the, using bullet points to describe your instructional strategies. And we've now called out specifically here, including UDL strategies. So we want them to, really note that here in this part of the learning segment template. Again, what the grouping strategies are, the ELD and academic language development that they're going to include in the lessons, the adaptations for students, differentiation, and then what resources and materials they're going to use to support the learning. So it's very similar to the lesson plan requirements from cycle 1, but again, it's across 3 to 5 lessons, and it includes the assessments. So then the next section, they outline what their assessment descriptions are. And there's a call out box. They're going to be including a blank sample of the assessment, what the assessment is, what the students are going to do, and then the rubrics for the student self-assessment and the formal assessment. So the upload blank copies of those. Again, the informal assessment is really focused on just one. I mean, again, across 3 to 5 lessons, a teacher informally assesses all the time, but they only need to document one that they will be using, that they're planning to use. And then also as part of that assessment, start to anticipate what do you think student responses to that informal assessment might be, and describe how they're going to monitor student learning as they move through the lessons. We then have the description of the student self-assessment. And again, this has to be based on using a rubric. Candidates will, particularly for multiple subjects, we have seen in the past, I think this is getting better. I think candidates are getting more proficient with developing rubrics. In the past, we've seen, particularly in multiple subjects, sort of that feelings rubric that, I feel happy about what I did, but the key here is that they have to have descriptive criteria related to the learning goals, and they have to have levels of performance. Also, we have seen in the past students including a checklist rather than a rubric. And again, a checklist is a wonderful instructional strategy to help keep students see where they are in progress towards completion of the work, but it's not a rubric. David, I really appreciate you. David is one of our lead assessors here, and thank you for keeping track of the chat. Really super helpful. So it's much appreciated. So then the formal assessment again the formal assessment can be a product, process, or a recorded performance. So the candidate that came in on Wednesday, she had done that, chosen the recorded performance. They're then going to develop a rubric that's related to the learning goals with those levels of performance that will guide their feedback, their assessment and feedback. And then also, are there any adaptations to the formal assessment that they are going to be using with particular students? And again, just some advice on thinking about formal assessments being age and developmentally appropriate. And there's some advice there on what that might look like. So for step 1 of cycle 2, there are parts A through F. So they've got the written narrative of contextual information. They have the learning segment template. They have a written narrative of assessment description. They have the description and a blank copy of the informal assessment, and the copies of the student self-assessment and the rubric, and the formal assessment in the rubric. And again, when an assessor scores the rubrics for step 1, these are the only sources of evidence that they look for. So as we're supporting candidates, what we want them to think about is when you're looking at that step 1 rubric, those step 1 rubrics, have these documents in front of you, because this is what the assessors will be using to score those rubrics. And if the evidence for a rubric is not found in one of these narratives, then it won't count as evidence if it's even if it's somewhere else. Okay.
Should we stop for questions?
Yeah, after step one, any questions coming up for you? And again, thank you, David, for keeping track of that. Super good information there. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat. If you want to raise your hand, we can. Add this link to the chat for printing purposes. Is Shane, which link are you referring to? You can unmute if you like. Or we can,
For the guide. So
oh,
I'm gonna
okay.
put the website link in there
Okay,
and the password.
there we go. And again, we're going through the multiple subjects cycle 2 guide, but they're pretty identical except with a few small variations. Thank you, Caroline.
Yep.
Okay.
Lessons cannot have hyperlinks, is that correct?
The candidates can put hyperlinks into the resources page, but yes, we don't want it. If you're saying like hyperlink out to another document that they've created, no, they can't do that. But if they're using, if they might be using an online video, if it's part of their instruction, they can include that on the resources and materials. That's helpful for the assessors to see what they're actually using for that. Okay. Again, we've added here just the language, the EL for the teach and assess piece. What they're going to do here is record the 3 to 5 lessons that they have developed. I can't say this enough. We really encourage candidates to film the entire lessons that they're doing and then go back and pick the video clips out of that full footage that they have. It's really difficult for candidates to try and capture a specific moment of students doing some aspect of what they're required to document. And so to really have the more video you have to pull from, the more likely you're going to find the thing that's actually going to really effectively show your teaching. So they're going to develop those 3 to 5 lessons. We just added the word ELD goals if appropriate here. Small wordsmithing change. And that again is if they have English learners that they documented in the context for learning. Again, there's some advice on adjusting your instruction, thinking about self-assessments, and giving some high-level pieces here to the teaching section. So the instructions on selecting and annotating video clips, if we can go down to there. Again, there are 4 video clips for cycle 2. And the first one, we asked them to sort of highlight them in particular order, video clip 1, 2, 3, or 4, but assessors will look for evidence of any of these requirements in all the videos. So if there's not a clear aspect of academic language development in video clip 1, but it's in video clip 3, they'll still be counted as evidence because it's still there. So clip 1 is instruction and assessment of academic language development. And again, it's up to 5 minutes. And this one is demonstrating how multiple students engage with content to develop the vocabulary necessary for the language demands of the lesson. We've added, it's not highlighted here, but at the end of each of the video clips, we have added the number of students that need to be seen and whether or not the candidate needs to be seen in that video clip. So this one is 2 or more, and the candidate needs to be seen in this video clip. So for video clip 2, the student's use of educational technology, They don't need to have the candidate showing in this video clip. We just need to see 2 or more students using it, actively using that educational technology. Okay. And again, using the use of educational technology, there's advice in the guide in the planning section around how to make that, how to use educational technology in not just a rote way. So one of the things we've heard rumors from candidates that there are certain programs like Quizlet. You can't use Quizlet or you'll get a low score if you use Quizlet. It's actually not true. It's not about the platform. It's what the students are doing with the platform. So if you've created a quiz on Quizlet and given it to them, that's not going to be a very high score. When we look at the rubrics later, you'll see how the language lays that out. Or if you're using something to instruct, technology to instruct the whole group with something, and they're not really using it actively, that's going to result in a low score. But if students are using Quizlet to develop a quiz of their own, or to synthesize their knowledge and information to really think about creating something on that platform, that's a different story. That's more active use. You know, if they're thinking about analysis of something, or they're thinking about synthesizing information. So it's not about the platform. It's really, again, what are the students doing with that? Let's see. Can we go come down here? Okay. Yeah, there we go. Thank you again, David. Okay, video clip 3. Again, here it's that instruction, informal assessment of content. So here we want to see them how the candidate provided multiple students to engage in deep learning of content and to develop their higher order thinking skills. So those again are analysis, synthesis, evaluation, interpretation, transfer. Again, those are the same processes that we want to see them using with educational technology. How they provided actionable feedback to the students, and then how they also addressed their instruction in the moment based on the informal assessment that they did in this video clip. Again, if you're recording an entire series of 3 to 5 lessons, there's going to be some point in there where you give you informally assess and you give feedback in the moment, and then you adjust your instruction. And so that's another reason for recording the entire lesson. Also, just to call out the higher order thinking, that deep learning and higher order thinking. We see, I really hate seeing this, but at times we'll see candidates do, they'll create a really interesting looking lesson. Like on paper, it looks really good, but what they have submitted in terms of their video clip is them kind of doing most of the talking to the class. They'll position the camera so they're kind of at the front and doing a lot of the talking. There's not very much interaction between students, even though the lessons that they develop seem to be really strong. So really encouraging candidates to capture the students, engage with the learning. So it's that dialogue back and forth between the teacher, between the students, and between students themselves is what's going to make help candidates score better in terms of those rubrics that have to do with higher order thinking. Yes, thank you, Amy. But yeah, absolutely. Some of the most effective submissions I've seen are where you'll see the candidate, filming themselves with the camera, and then actually you see the camera go over and put it down next to a group of students who are having a conversation, and then you can hear them and see them all talking. So not thinking of the camera as a static object in the room is actually really helpful, or having somebody else film it. I know that's difficult at times, but the closer you can get to seeing and hearing what the students are doing, the better. Okay, video clip 4. This one is, again, focused on having the candidate model the rubric for the self-assessment activity that they've developed. So we want to see them modeling that with students. Again, they don't need to model the entire rubric. I would say in a 5-minute video clip, if you have a complex rubric, or even for younger children, a fairly simple rubric, modeling an entire rubric in 5 minutes is not a good instructional strategy anyway, but to model a part of the rubric and say, so now you're going to assess yourselves on this part. That's perfectly fine because they're modeling the rubric, they're having students use that rubric. And then they're providing feedback. So the change from 2 years ago is that all of those 3 things needed to be captured in the 5-minute video clip. And that was difficult to capture all the modeling the rubric, seeing the students use the rubric, and then providing feedback. So now the only thing we need to see in the video clip is the first 2, how they model that self-assessment rubric and how the students, one or more students, assess themselves on that. They can provide the feedback in part H. If they capture it on the video clip, it's okay. They don't need to include it in part H, but it frees up a little bit, makes the video clip a little bit more natural, I think, in terms of timing. Let's see. Yeah, we got feedback from programs on that one, and from assessors and from candidates themselves. So I think it was a good change as well. We also have added that we want candidate students must be visible and conversations must be clearly audible in 1, 3, and 4. We actually don't need to hear, we don't need to see the candidate in educational technology, and we can also the image, the camera can be more capturing the ed tech rather than the conversation if that's appropriate. Again, I will say assessors do a really good job of listening to what's going on and making sense of it. But I would just give advice to any candidate that show it to somebody who wasn't there. And if they can make sense of what's going on, then an assessor certainly will. We've added, again, same as in cycle 1, some clarity on the annotations. So again, in the past, we've had difficulty with candidates submitting where they were annotating in a way that it wasn't clear what they were talking about. So sometimes candidates would do a timestamp for the entire 5 minutes and then have an annotation title there. So it's it's like, where is this happening? The assessors will watch the entire video clip to find that. But I think at times the candidates were maybe missing the point of what the annotation and the timestamp is. And it's really about you showing the assessor something specific that you want them to see about what you were doing and why you were doing it. And this is that I think one of the things as teachers, and for young teachers in particular, is we want to really build that concept of intentionality, that they're being intentional in their teaching. They know what they're doing in any given moment, and they know why they're doing it. And this is an opportunity for them to show that with the saying, this is where this moment is happening, and this is the annotation and my description of why that goes along with that. So there's some instructions here. We have a call out box that says do not set timestamps so that the entire duration of the video clip. That's not going to receive them a condition code or a lower score, but really it's more just sort of strong advice to really choose specific moments in those 5-minute video clips. So then they have the annotation titles for this. And again, same as in cycle 1, they have to use all of these annotation titles at least once, but across the 4 video clips. And they can use them multiple times, but they all have to be used at least once. So again, the first one is assessing student learning and development of academic language, students using educational technology, providing content-specific feedback to students, assessing students' learning and using age or developmentally appropriate higher order thinking skills. That was from 3, video clip 3. And then the next one, I believe we got one more. Oh, no, that's it. Okay. So those are the 4 annotation titles that we need to see. Again, they can use them as many times as they need to. Again, we also advice for candidates. Sometimes we see them just put the title in. But what we really want them to do here is to say, so here's the title, here's my explanation of what that was, and here's why I was doing it. The why is really critical for this, in order to support a stronger score. Okay, and then this is about submitting the annotations. Okay, then they're going to analyze, so at the end of step 2, they're going to analyze the informal and student self-assessments. So here are the prompts around that. Again, how did they use the informal assessment to learn about age, the higher order thinking skills in students and support students' academic language development? How did they think about that informal assessment and student self-assessment to provide feedback? How did they help the student to understand what they need to do next to continue to progress? That's around the feedback that they provided. And again, the idea of how did these 2 assessments give you insights about the student's own understanding, and again, a reflection on the student's use of educational technology to enhance, improve, or demonstrate their learning goals. And we'll go to the next section. So that's setting them up, really thinking about what happened with their informal and student self-assessment, is setting them up for step 3. And there are these, the 2 sources of evidence, which are the annotated video clips, so 4 of them, and that part H. And that's also where that part H is also where they include the feedback based on the student self-assessment. So again, in cycle 1, reflection was really, how did it go? What did you plan? What happened? What are your thoughts about that? And this one, for cycle 2, reflect is really more about a detailed analysis of the formal assessment. So what they're going to do is analyze the rubric for the whole class. They're going to think about and document which students exceeded the learning goals, which students met the learning goals, and which students need more instructional support, and really parse that out for the entire class. They're then going to choose 3 students' work samples as evidence. And again, for cycle 1, they chose the 3 focus students at the beginning in their planning stage. For this, they choose them after they see the results of the formal assessments. And so they choose a student again who exceeded. Student 1 is the student who exceeded the learning goals. Student 2 is the one that met the learning goals. And student 3 did not yet meet or needs additional instruction and support. And they have work samples for each of those students. You can scroll down. And again, that call-out box, we get this from candidates at times. We hear, all my students either met or exceeded, or I don't have all 3 categories. So thinking about choosing students that you can demonstrate differential levels of a performance, even if they all met, or even if they all exceeded the learning goals. Okay. This is, again, repeating what we talked about earlier about if you're doing, actually the first call-out box, I'm sorry, is around this process-based assessment. So they might not have a document that the students do. There might be something else like a video that they have, and they might not have the ability to write the feedback on the student's work or provide that. So they can, if that's the case, they can include that in the narrative part J. And again, here's some, we clarified a little bit the instructions on what they're supposed to do with the student work. So they label each piece to say that the student exceeded, met, or did not yet meet. If they can, if at all possible, remove the names of the students. And then they include the rubric-based detailed feedback that is included with each sample, whether that's in Part J or attached to the student's work. And then again, if it's a marked up rubric, they can include that. If it's given to the students in some other way, they can include that. And then they're going, when they upload it, they're going to have those 3 labels for the students when they upload response 1, response 2, and response 3. So here is the document where they look at the learning of the entire class, the number of students who exceeded, number of students who met, number of students who have not yet met. They're then going to analyze those results, looking for those patterns and trends, what happened across the class, thinking about errors and skills, thinking about strengths and understandings that the students demonstrated through that. Then we've added language here to prompt number 3. What did the results from the formal assessments tell you about what was most and least effective about your instructional response? And we added in helping students achieve the learning goals and ELD goals are appropriate. We had some candidates who would sometimes respond what was most effective, but not really in relation to the learning goals, and that's what it really should be. Again, for students who did not yet meet, what do you need to do next to support them? And then the next piece is what really documenting the feedback. So what detailed feedback did they provide to the whole class? And then for the 3 students that they have the work samples. Should the table freeze? Okay. So Nancy, should the table for results of formal assessments be the same as the formal assessment rubric? The table up here, no, they're just going to, sometimes candidates will have a 5-level rubric. So they'll need to know which students on that rubric exceeded the expectations. Is it just one level, the highest level, or is it some other way that they have? Is, you know, how are they determining which students based on that rubric exceeded expectations, met expectations, and did not quite meet? And then they just interpret those results or record those results in this table. And then Anna, if there are no ELD students in the class, there doesn't need to be any response to help. Yes, if there are no ELD goals and no ELD English learners in the class. That's correct. Okay. And then they have a little reflection on how will they assist. Can we go back up just a little bit? How will they assist the whole class and the individuals to use the rubric specific feedback to revise their work? So they're providing that feedback and then thinking about what are they going to do with the students in terms of using that feedback. Could the formal assessment rubric have criteria that difference? The formal assessment should be aligned to the learning goals. Thank you, Nancy. What we're seeing is we've got the standards, we've got the learning goals that are aligned to the standards. The assessments are then aligned to those learning goals, and then the feedback is aligned to the language in the rubric. Thank you, David. Okay, and then we have the evidence to be submitted. So for the reflection rubric, step 3 rubric, there are 2 pieces of evidence: the formal assessment responses of the students' work, of the 3 students' work, and then the Part J written narrative, the analysis of formal assessments. Okay, let's pause here. I see we've got some good questions coming in. Anybody want to raise your hand, unmute, and ask another question at this point? Okay. All right, thanks. Okay, for step 4 apply, again, this is a little bit more complex than step 1 or than cycle 1. In cycle 1, they really sort of thought about how do the students do with this lesson and what would they do in the future. For step 4 apply for cycle 2, they're actually going to teach an additional lesson here based on the informal assessment, student self-assessment, and the formal assessment. Here, if you look at that highlighted part, we've highlighted that because in step 4, they need to include evidence from all of 3 kinds of assessment in thinking about what their next lesson is going to be that they document and apply. And then they're also going to bring in evidence from the learning segment, clips, and everything that they described before. And again, as with cycle 1 for steps 3 and 4, there's those 2, they generally have the 2 pieces of evidence that the assessors will look at, but the candidates are required to cite evidence from their previous steps. That's a key piece that sometimes candidates fall down on, and we'll see when we look at the rubrics that will result in a lower score. So again, the idea is that the assessors are not going to go back and look at previous steps as they score these rubrics. So we want the candidate needs to provide the evidence from those earlier steps that they want the assessor to consider in looking at their performance around those 2 rubrics. That's a key piece. Sometimes they'll speak sort of vaguely about what happened, but it's not clear what that evidence is. So, it's almost them retelling the story of what happened in step 3 and step 4. So again, we have a few more reflection points. What was most effective about their teaching and the learning segment? What was less effective? It's a question of what goal do you want to set for yourself as an educator, and your professional learning goals based on the experience you've had here. And then the next part is the follow-up instruction. So here they're going to either develop a lesson that is a reteach, or they're going to develop a lesson that's an extension. It can be for the whole class. It can be for a group of students, a small group of students. And a couple of things to keep in mind here. Really impress upon candidates not to include this lesson in the original learning segment. Sometimes they do that and it appears that they have planned this lesson before they analyze the results of the assessments. And so that will, really the idea is after the learning segment instruction is over, think about what happened and then design an additional lesson. The lesson also, if we scroll down a little bit, and again, here's that language. It must be unique to step 4 and not repeated from the earlier lesson. The lesson also needs to be different in terms of pedagogy or instructional strategies or resources or materials that they're using. It's like that idea, if you're going to extend the learning, do something different. If you're going to support the learning, do something different from what was not as effective in the earlier in your earlier learning segment. So if we can scroll down. So again, and here they name whether it's reteach or an extension. Is it for the whole class or a small group? They have the learning goals that are associated with this lesson. And again, they will be based on those learning goals that were defined in step 1. And then if they have English learners in their whole class, but English learners are not in this portion of the class that this lesson is for, they do not need to cite ELD goals for this lesson. But if there are English learners in the group, they have to cite ELD goals for this part. This is a change from last year where that requirement is there. And then we also ask them, if you're not using the ELD goals, why do you not have them? And it might be as simple as, I don't have any English learners in this group. And then they provide a rationale for why this different activity is likely to support students' further development or understanding of what was already covered. Okay, they also talk about their checks for understanding and academic language instruction, and then think about the adaptations. And then they teach and record the follow-up instruction, similarly to what they did in step 2. And again, this can be up to 5 minutes as well. And then their annotation is to indicate, can we go back up just a little bit? That underneath that box is to indicate where in the activity new understanding or learning occurred for their students. So we're looking to see something new that happened for the students, and they're just documenting that. Okay. Again, we repeat the annotation instructions. And here's that annotation title, follow-up instruction where learning occurred. Okay. And we have the 2 pieces of evidence for this. Part K was the written narrative, and then part L, the annotated video clip. Okay, let's see. I just want to go back. If anybody has a question that we haven't hit yet, or I'm just going to go back here and take a look at some of the questions. I think we've either covered most of them or David has hit them for us. Thank you, David. Amy's included there too. Okay, so we've gone through the step-by-step. Are there any new questions? I see a couple coming in. Okay. Okay. And I think, Nancy, we covered that about the formal assessment criteria rubric. Correct. Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So we're going to go into the rubrics. Again, the essential questions are here. We'll cover them as we look at the rubrics because there are some changes in the rubrics. So for rubric 2.1, the major change here, we've added a few and ors like over in level 1, looking at what kind of rubric-based evidence they're going to cite. But that fourth construct, rubrics clearly align with the learning goals and will enable the candidate to score student learning consistently. That actually used to be in rubric 2.7 in the rubric where they're in the rubric that measures their assessment of the formal assessments. We felt that was misplaced there, and that was actually really a component of the planning in step 1 rather than of the reflection step. So we moved that, we brought that up here. The language is exactly the same as it was previously, though. And there's the sources of evidence for that first rubric, part A through part F. Step 2 or rubric 2.2, we don't have any changes here. But again, it's really focused on how, and actually, you know, can we go to rubric 2.1? I want to name something here. Sometimes it's interpreted that rubric 2.1 and 2.2 are the same in some ways. If we can go look at the essential question for 2.1. So this one is really, how does the candidate's learning segment plan provide appropriate learning goals and ELD goals that offer multiple ways for all students to demonstrate their knowledge and affirm and validate students' assets, strengths, and backgrounds. So this is really about what all those pieces are of the learning segment that's going to support students in learning the content. The next rubric sounds similar, but I'm just going to point out a small difference. So how does the candidate plan a learning segment in which the assessments and rubrics instructional strategies are aligned and build on one another? So this one is measuring, rather than what's the sort of what are the individual content pieces and the instructional strategies and the assessments. This one is measuring how the learning is basically a continuum across the 3 to 5 lessons. That's a key piece for this. Candidates who it's not clear that they might have 3 to 5 lessons that are documented, but it's not really clear what the connections between them are and how those 3 to 5 lessons are going to build the students' knowledge over time as they experience those lessons. That's what this rubric is measuring. So we really want candidates to really think about that. Like how is your students' understanding, knowledge, and skill going to be fundamentally different across having done all of these the learning segment in its totality. So that there's slightly different ways that they're measuring that here between 1 and 2. Okay. Rubric 2.3. This one is, how does the candidate support student development and demonstration of academic language in relation to the content specific learning goals? So 2.3 is about step 2. So this will be assessed by observing the annotations and the video clips. We highlighted English learners because of all we've done there is taken out standard English learners. But the rubric is substantially the same. Okay. Step 4 is that how is the candidate using educational technology to provide opportunities for students to enhance, improve, and demonstrate knowledge and skill here. And again, we talked about that earlier, that it's really, what are they doing with it to actually, for bringing those higher order thinking skills, and how is the technology enhancing that? The highlighted section here, we've updated the examples. I think previously one of the examples was pen pals, which I'm not sure that that's really connected to ed tech these days, but we wanted to update those a little bit. Rubric 2.5 is also a teach and assess. This one is really, again, the video clips where they're monitoring student learning, thinking about the deep learning of content, and then adjusting their instruction based on their informal assessment. That's what this one is measuring here. And then we also have some examples on step 4 that we've updated a little bit, and thinking about multiple ways for students to demonstrate their learning. Rubric 2.6 is the one that's measuring their work with student self-assessment, and providing them effective feedback based on their modeling of that student self-assessment, the students using the self-assessment, and then providing that feedback. So then rubric 2.7 is on how are they reflecting, and is still about step 2, teach and assess. How are they using those informal assessment results and student self-assessment to provide that actionable feedback to students to further their learning and revise their work. And now we get to 2.8, which is the reflection rubric. We've changed the language in the essential question, where we're asking them to think about the lessons, the learning segment they did, and their planning. Thinking about what was most and least effective about their instructional approach. And then we added the constructs towards the end here. This was actually the one where we pulled that construct out and put it into rubric 2.1. But the constructs now that we've added here are measuring the effectiveness of the feedback that they provided the students. So is that appropriate? Is the feedback appropriate for the whole class, students 1, 2, or 3? Level 2, the feedback might be vague or minimally related to rubric. That was that question that we had. That feedback has to really be aligned with that rubric. That's how that all comes all the way through there. And then level 1 is that they just didn't provide feedback to the students. And the last rubric on the apply, so if this is really thinking about the effectiveness of how they documented their what they're going to do, either developing a reteach lesson or an extension lesson, and providing that rationale. What's the effectiveness of their rationale? So we've added this construct here of providing an extension activity. The activity deepens and advances students' learning in relation to the content-specific learning goals and ELD goals if appropriate. So I think we didn't have it connected to, we didn't have that last part of the language that it was related to the learning goals. So again, we want candidates to really think about making that through line from the learning goals from the beginning, step 1. Okay, and then we've got the whole section on submitting their evidence and the glossary, which we will stop there. Can we go to gallery mode, Caroline? I just wanted to see where we are on questions here. Anything coming up for you on this, or questions that you have in terms of working with candidates or clarity of the guide? And again, I think we've been covering a lot in the chat here. Okay, no questions. Okay, thank you, Deborah, for that comment. It's nice. We really do listen to programs and candidates and assessors. We get a lot of information from that. And then also looking at the scores, looking at the performance, the seeing the number of candidates who were getting condition codes for ELD standards and goals really prompted that push to add additional support for that. Okay, thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. It's a work in progress. So, okay. So with that, we thought we would just again take Caroline's going to go ahead and give us the update on the condition codes.
Yep. Did you want to go over the program guide at all?
Why don't we do that after the condition codes?
Okay, that sounds good. Okay. So, condition codes are applied to a candidate's submission when one or more parts of the submission is incomplete or not meeting the requirements of everything that Zoltan just covered in the guide. They're broken into separate categories so we can give the candidate as much information as possible. The A is submission requirements are not met. B and C are video and audio requirements are not met. So like Zoltan was talking about, you can't see 2 students, or the candidate is missing, or maybe the audio is inaudible. Category D is document requirements are not met. E is insufficient or excessive documentation. F talks about translation requirements. And G is video annotation requirements are not met. I really quickly am going to put this into the chat where you can find these submission requirements and condition codes on the CTC website. But the updates to the condition codes from year 4 to year 5 were really done with the intention of reinforcing the idea that we want all the submissions scored whenever possible. So to do that, many of the condition codes were eliminated and many were clarified to be more specific ultimately, in order to give the candidate as much information as possible as to what kept them from getting, receiving a score on their submission. I believe the only new one is, let me go to the website, A89. So if you go to the website, the link I just put into the chat, you'll find this section, submission requirements and condition codes, where you will find towards the halfway through all of those condition codes broken into the different categories that I just mentioned. So it's my understanding that A89 is the only new one. And if in cycle 2, your candidate doesn't have an ELD student, then they don't have to have ELD learning goals and standards. But if they do talk about having an ELD student and they miss that piece, they would receive an A89 code. But that is the only new one. Some have been eliminated for redundancies and just to keep things as clear as possible. Anything to add?
No, I think that's good. Thank you, Caroline. Again, our goal is to eliminate condition codes if at all possible, but again, we have to have them because we want to make sure that a candidate has the evidence that they need to get a full and appropriate score. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left. I'd just like to go to the program guide. Just call your attention to it. I think it's a really useful document. It expands a lot on what we shared here today. And I'd like to, there's a couple of sections that I would just like to highlight. If we can go to page 12 of the guide. So this is on the section, again, I think sometimes candidates have things around the funds of knowledge and asset-based instructions. I think sometimes we see in candidates planning, it's really, that's asset-based instruction is not a strength. And so on page 12, we have a section, and again, this is for programs and thinking about supporting candidates. We have a background on what the asset-based instruction is, but if you go to page 13, we have some examples here of, so if we think about prior knowledge and skills related to the content of the lesson, that's one of the things we're asking them to think about. So we have a couple of examples there that candidates might want to, again, sharing these with candidates and other examples from your own work with them. I think it can be a real help in particularly this area. If we go also to page what is it, page 17. I highlighted that aspect of higher order thinking skills. And again, as I said, often when we see a learning segment that looks strong on paper, but when we see the candidates actually implement it, it's more like didactic teaching than actual development of higher order thinking skills. And so just really thinking about some of these aspects that as we're sharing with candidates, and to think about is this demonstrated in your video clip? In my own coaching of teachers, one of my rules with them is, you have a classroom of 20 students. So ideally, actually, you should have 1/20th of the airspace. You're going to have more because you're the teacher. But if you're doing 90% of the talking, we want to flip that a little bit. And so those ideas of how can we help candidates see that even though you're filming yourself and your students, it's really okay for you to be documenting much more of the students' talk than your talk, because that's going to more result in those higher order thinking skills and demonstrating those. And so with that, I just wanted to highlight a couple of those points and draw your attention to that program guide. I think there's some real nuggets in there throughout there. So if we can go back to gallery mode, and we'll take some final questions here. Anything coming up for y'all? You can raise your hand, you can put it in the chat, you can just unmute and ask if you like. Okay. I'm going to, again, put my email address in the chat. Please feel free to reach out anytime. We've also got our, do we have a slide on the office hours, Caroline? Just put that back up.
Not on office hours, but I do have the contact information.
Yeah, okay. And you just put that in there. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Again, if you look at that's our contact information. Again, going to the PSDE news, letting candidates know about office hours. We have program office hours as well. We often have program faculty in our candidate office hours as well. We do give priority to the candidates that are there, but it's always nice to have faculty in those meetings as well. And with that, if we can go back to gallery, and we'll stay on for a moment in case somebody has an additional question, but really thank you so much for all your work. I hope you have a very restful weekend. It seems like it's cooling off here in California a little bit, so I hope it's a great weekend.
Where can folks find the office hours? Is that in PSDE news?
PSDE news, yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Happy Friday.
Yeah. It's good to see you all. Okay.
I had a quick question if you have a minute.
Yeah, absolutely.
So is there anybody who is there during office hours that has a music background that will be able to really understand the musical concepts when trying to design submissions for the TPA?
So in those office hours, we don't provide that kind of advice. What we provide is clarity on the guide itself and the requirements of the guide. So were you in when I was talking about the music teacher that came on this last Wednesday? Were you in the meeting?
Yes, that story really piqued my interest, and I was wondering if there was anyone there that had that kind of knowledge, to be able to kind of give guidance.
Yeah, so we would not be giving guidance on that, but what we can give guidance on, like, what are those requirements for documenting the differential learning of students in a group formal assessment, no matter what it is, no matter what the content is. And so the question that we had, that we asked is, can you tell which student exceeded the expectations, and how do you know that? I would ask that if it was a discussion group for a history class. I would ask that of any discipline. So we don't give advice on specific, like how to structure for a specific discipline, but we do provide support on how to interpret the guide.
Okay, perfect. Just because I know that's the biggest thing when I'm working with the music teachers, is they're unsure that what they are doing, hopefully as good music educators, is really going to be adequate for the TPA. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate you giving that insight, because then I can keep pushing them towards just really articulating what we naturally do as music educators. That sometimes is hard to see from the audience.
Yes, and the guides are also based on subject-specific pedagogy. So you'll want to look at those documents that really focus on subject-specific pedagogy for music. And you can also depend, the assessor, when an assessor is going to be scoring a music submission, that assessor is a music teacher or a music educator of some kind. So they're familiar with good practice, and they're also familiar with the, stresses and issues that come with a music class, for example. So they know what goes on in those spaces, and that helps them interpret a little bit. So they do bring their judgment to that.
Okay, excellent. That's good to know. I just want to reassure them. They're always so nervous. So I appreciate that information. Thank you.
Yeah, but I really think the subject-specific pedagogy documents will really help with that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay, take care.
Well, Ton, I have a quick question for
Sure.
you. It goes back to the learning goals that was mentioned in the chat. I know that you have to have consistent learning goals during your learning segment, but if a candidate is working on, let's say, one particular standard, but during those 3 to 5 lessons, there may be different learning goals associated with each lesson.
Mhm.
And this ties back to the rubrics.
Mhm.
Can we see some of those learning goals or even those topics to show up as a criteria? I'm almost feeling like they should, because these are the ones that they've been covering during this learning.
Yeah. So there's so if they're going to be in the rubric, they should have them in the planning section.
Mhm.
There are also, there are, as you said, there are incidental learning goals that come up along the way.
Mhm.
They want to make sure that they have planned around learning goals, and they have created some rubrics ahead of time. That also, and then also, there's, I think people say, do I have to cover every single learning goal that we're covering? It's like, you want to really name the primary learning goals.
Okay.
And then I always think of it as like, what are the primary and then what are the secondary? I'm gonna assess around the primary.
Okay.
goals.
That's good to know, because I feel like they get stuck with, they may be picking 3 to 5, but there may be in between lessons along
Yeah,
that point.
yeah,
So they may be picking up other things, like, focusing on other learning goals that are not showing up in their learning segment, because
yeah,
they specifically focus on those 3 to 5 lessons.
yeah. One of the ways that we at an organization I worked at before, one of the ways we talked about that was there's the intended curriculum.
Mhm.
This is the standards and goals that we intend the student. That's the big thing, right? There's then what we call the enacted curriculum. So these are the set of those that I'm going to enact in a particular learning segment or particular project or whatever it is. I'm going to focus on those. And then the third one is, what's the assessed curriculum? So those are the learning goals that I'm going to focus my assessment on, because to me, those are the ones I want to make sure that my students have developed.
Okay.
And so, like, you're sort of funneling down almost
Mhm.
from the entire set of standards for the grade level down to what's happening and what am I assessing for this particular learning segment.
That's great to know. I may have more questions.
Well, fire away.
No, we're gearing up. As I said, we're starting to do the TPA supports again for
Okay.
fall, and we do it each semester to assist our candidates here. So as they work on their TPA, they come up with they experience bumps along the way, and we're like, that's a great. Let me figure out what that means.
Yeah, I know. And sometimes just the way they phrase the question, you really have to think about it a little bit. Yeah.
Yes, and we refer back to the guys and we're like, this is not really fully answered by the guys, so let me contact.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Hey, Barbara, how are you doing today? You're on mute. There we go. You have a question for us, Barbara? No, maybe your audio is out. Any questions for us? Okay. All right,
Should we stop the recording?
yeah, why don't we do good advice there? Hold on.